Hi, this is Dr. Matthew Giobbi. Welcome to part 2 of our lecture on traditional marketing and neuromarketing through the media psychology lens. I want to take a few moments to open this part of the lecture up, discussing something that's been very popular, the idea of subliminal advertising. Subliminal advertising, in essence, is the thought that messages are allegedly embedded so deeply in an ad that they cannot be perceived consciously. There's no evidence for subliminal advertising effect. So where does this come from, the idea of subliminal advertising, the influence of subliminal advertising? And why do we find that we still find individuals who are convinced that this subliminal advertising works, this priming effect, as we might call it in psychology? Firstly, there was a study done in 1993 that found that 72% of the people who were asked, general public who were asked about subliminal advertising, felt that it had an impact on people's purchasing behavior, that it could influence. This is largely a myth. The concept of subliminal advertising was promoted in 1957 by a fellow named Jim Vickery, who was had a marketing research business in New Jersey. And he claimed that he exposed movie audiences to subliminal commands: drink Coca-Cola and eat popcorn, and that he flashed it on the screen for less than a millisecond, a half a second. And what he claimed was that 57.5% of Coke sales went up, and that he increased Coke sales this way by 57%. And then when he was called to the Senate committee for subliminal advertising, this caused quite an uproar when we released this information. He couldn't replicate the results that he found, and ultimately he had to renounce he claimed that it was a marketing ploy, that there was no subliminal effect. It's estimated that through 1957 and 1958, he collected nearly $4 million in consulting fees, and then he just dropped out of the scene. There's a contemporary researcher, Wilson Bryan Key. He was a professor at the university in Canada, and he is continuing this work, and he uncovers many ads today from contemporary sources that have subliminal messages hidden in them. No one's quite sure what the purpose of these are. There's no evidence to suggest that they have any effect on sales whatsoever. So it might be marketing companies convincing a product that subliminal messaging works. Of course, there's no evidence for this. My suspicion is that there are certain products that enjoy the game of hiding messages in the ad, and that the people who are drawn towards those products might enjoy the concept of a subliminal ad, or the intrigue that's involved in finding it, and maybe that appeals almost like can you find it, can you see it game. Maybe it appeals to individuals who are looking for these messages in that product, and that might make them like the product even more. I don't know, but nevertheless, the myth of subliminal advertising is something you should definitely be aware of. You can look into the work of Wilson Bryan Key. Certainly, in our book reading of the Hidden Persuaders, which was Vance Packard's book. If you notice when it was published, 1957. This is right around the time when Vickery published announced his subliminal marketing tools. So you'll be reading about that in there as well. But just keep in mind that there is no evidence that any type of subliminal marketing works. Turning our attention to a topic that we're going to cover more in depth in our topic on media effects, we look at advertising in children. It turns out that children are the most susceptible to advertising. In 1978, there was a Federal Trade Commission study published, Television Advertising to Children, and it found that children between the ages of 2 and 7 see approximately 20,000 television commercials a year. Of course, this is now surely increased, but there were recommendations made that were never implemented about banning certain commercials from programming on children that were under the age of 7. It turns out that the most influential, as we'll see later, research in media effects really the adolescents and children are the most susceptible to any type of advertising. So most susceptible children, 13 and younger, certainly 20 and under 20 years is most susceptible to advertising. We're speaking in generalities here, statistically speaking. But those formative years, those first 6 to 7 years of life, children are very special audience members, as we'll see. There's been a trend in product placement nowadays. We see something like a Disney 2-hour cartoon, which is actually serving as a 2-hour commercial for much of the products that are then associated with that programming. So Happy Meals and action figures, etc. So the movie in itself isn't the revenue generator. It's functioning as a big commercial itself that then generates revenue in licensing fees. So as recently as 2006, there have been new restrictions put on to children's advertising programming. So if you watch television and remember the cartoons even from the 1980s, 90s, 2000s, there is a buffer that the cartoon segment ends, and there's a distinct description that will be back out after these messages from our sponsors or from the advertisers. So there's a buffer that clearly shows that the cartoon is ending and the advertising is beginning. Now, this was directives that happened many years ago to make the advertising distinct from the programming for children. You'll also notice that there's a blackout period for a number of seconds between programming and commercials. Now, this was all legislated and is required by programmers, by networks, to make a distinction between the programming and the advertisement. We see that there was a major drop in cigarette smoking after there were restrictions on making cigarette ads look like cartoon characters. Camel in particular was one of these. But then when cigarette ads were banned completely from television programming, we saw a distinct drop in cigarette sales and cigarette smoking. So these cigarette brands were actually imprinting as if they were cartoons for children. And the ads themselves, if you look at the history of these cigarette ads, they were looking more and more like advertising for children. And this was thought by many critics to be a way of indoctrinating children into future smoking once they hit adolescent years. This idea that this was the cool. It's actually called breaking the code of cool in advertising. Nowadays, the target is foods, sugary foods, and junk foods. And so there's a lot of advocacy groups hoping to have more restrictions placed on the advertising for unhealthful foods. To turn our attention now to a field that's related to advertising, and that's public relations, also called PR. In public relations, we look at a history and a bit of an overview of what public relations does for this introduction to media psychology course. Public relations is basically defined as the management function that establishes and maintains mutually beneficial relationships between an organization and the publics on whom its successes or failures depends. Basically, public relations is the public face of a company. And that faces to two publics, the internal public and the external public. So the internal public would be the employees and the shareholders, etc., of the corporation. The external public would be the people who are purchasing the products and etc. So the public is any group of people who share a common set of interests and goals, but these include internal publics, which are made up of people within the organization, and external publics, people consist outside of this organization. So the PR people are the ones who really promote the image of the corporation, the message of the corporation. They're often the people who are employed in damage control. So, for example, if BP has a major oil spill, the PR people are the ones who get out and tell the administrators, the president, the CEO, whomever, what to say, how to say it, when to say it, where to say it, how to present the message to make the corporation appear to be in the best light as possible. So PR is their public relations for governments, for basically any organization. Now, we're going to take a look at the history and also, firstly, some of the differences between PR and advertising, because it's a bit of a blurry boundary at times. So here's a little bit of an overview of PR. Firstly, PR versus advertising. Advertising is controlled. It's purchased publicity. So advertisements are clearly labeled as advertisements. PR is usually favorable media publicity, and it's fed through reporters, through news agencies, through articles, through talk shows, and through events. That's a PR campaign. So we'll come to find that newspapers can often be used to advertise as for free, as if it was a newsworthy story. So there are 2,900 PR companies internationally, 1,900 in the U.S. There's in-house PR. So in-house PR would be a company has its own PR personnel that handles most of the work, but when a big specialty issue comes up, such as the BP oil spill or presidential campaigns, there are actual PR companies that will specialize in political PR, military PR, etc. So most of these individuals have journalism degrees. So it's anything you can imagine, any type of entity. You should be aware of the professional organization for public relations. It's PR Newswire. And PR Newswire, here's the website, prnewswire.com. Will give you all the background you'd need on any type of questions for public relations. They'll tell you, if you look at what kind of agency that you're in, government, not-for-profit, privately held with major employees, CEO, and you can find insights just for you. Some of the ideas would be here. A day in the life of PR and corporate communications professionals, building relationships with media and influencers. Of course, the media means the news for the most part. Media monitoring, the modern market fulcrum, balancing content and big data, power PR. So this is a great resource, PR Newswire, to further your knowledge about public relations in general. So there are 6 major PR firms worldwide: WPP, Omnicom, Dentsu, Publicis, Aegis, and IPG. And you can look at these and see what they're about. For example, on the Publicis website, you can see their different campaigns, and you can watch the videos about the campaigns. Here, the City Bike campaign for New York City, different commercials that you see, and you'll learn about the campaigns themselves. So this is where Publicis introduces themselves to potential clients and shows samples of their work and how they do what they do. So that is a great resource, and it's good to be aware of these 6 major PR firms, that they exist, who they are, who they represent. Now, there's an very interesting. The history of PR is very interesting. Mostly, we have in the early years the land grab. So this is the settlement of the western part of our country, and this was mostly promoted through myths like Old West myths, etc. So people like Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett, who were real people, but became spokespeople for frontier living. In other words, appealing to Europeans and to Northeasterners in the original 13 colonies to purchase land and out west and go and settle on the frontier. These individuals were used as figureheads in a PR way to appeal to folks to go out and settle the West. Buffalo Bill's Wild West. Buffalo Bill's, if you've heard of Buffalo Bill and his Rough Riders Congress, this was a traveling show, almost like an Indian, cowboy Indian type show that recreated the gunfights and civil wars in this Old West. And it turns out that this is mostly myth. This myth was created, this Old West myth that we even watch in Western television shows and movies, was really created by Buffalo Bill and his Rough Rider show. So this is another example of public relations. It's not exactly advertising. It's sending out a certain message, a certain ideology to the public that they then incorporate. It became part of the national fabric. We see Barnum and Bailey, P.T. Barnum, perhaps one of the greatest PR individuals of the 19th and early 20th century. So this creating this spectacle of the greatest show on earth and convincing people to come to his museums and to his museum in New York City and into his circus. This is all the beginnings of early public relations, of creating a spectacle, a media event. But we really look to railroads and technology as being the earliest for PR. So in the 1800s, the businesses wanted to use press agents, or what we today call public relations agents, to get the government to fund railroads, to get people to invest in railroads, which was ultimately for capitalist endeavors. So the different companies were trying to get the government and stockholders to build the railroads so that they didn't have to invest their money into to the railroads. The railroads would then carry their goods and services, which is interesting. So it's PR agents were used to convince the public to get the government officials to build the railroad system. So Illinois Central Railroad was one of the first to lobby. North-South Railroad would ease tensions so the government should fund it. This is what they claimed. The government should fund their railroad system because it would ease pre-Civil War tensions between the North and the South by creating a traveling link between them. So the idea here was, how can we convince the people and the government to build these railroads so that private industry doesn't have to invest in them? This is very interesting to consider when realizing that private industry often touts that government interference makes things, confounds things. Of course, when it works to the advantage, there's no turning it down, the government funding. Railroad strategies to get government tax funding: buy news articles about rail travel, and it's called deadheading, free rail passes to reporters. So this is not unlike when the press are given free access passes to certain events, and so they write reviews in exchange for the free tickets. Well, this was free railroad travel, which then the article, it would insinuate that the press people would then write more favorable articles about the railroad because their travel was free. Railroad strategies to control rates and reduce competition. And Interstate Commerce Act of 1881 is a PR campaign used to get this passed by railroads to increase rates and eliminate fare reduction and freight classification. So PR is used by businesses to manipulate the public and the government to do favorable things within their that would favor their corporate interests. Now, AT&T that we discussed before, they used lobbying, PR lobbyists, against competition, and tried to convince the public and the government that a monopoly telephone company would be the best way to serve the public. That actually competition would, if there were competing companies for telephone, it would actually not create a strong national telephone company, national telephone service. So AT&T tried to get around monopoly, antitrust and monopoly rules that the government had in place by influencing the public and government officials through PR agents to convince them that this sort of monopoly would be good. Now we come to this figure, Edward Bernays. He's very interesting. He's called the father of public relations. Bernays is fascinating to us in psychology because he's also the nephew of Sigmund Freud. And you'll learn much about Bernays in the documentaries that you'll be watching, etc. Bernays set up much of what PR is today. He called it public opinion research. His famous books, Propaganda and Crystallizing Public Opinion. Bernays, here's a classic Bernays scenario. He writes the egg council, or the egg farmers council, and the pork farmers council hire Bernays to increase sales of eggs or sales of pork. So Bernays sends out questionnaires to doctors and says, is a high-protein breakfast more healthful than a low-protein breakfast? Of course, doctors respond on these little postcards and say, yes, a high-protein breakfast is more healthful. Bernays then releases a report. 9 out of 10 doctors agree. Eating bacon and eggs for breakfast is more healthful for you. So this is the kind of PR business that Bernays was into. He worked for the United States government during the end of World War I for relations in Europe and the armistice in Europe. He worked for cigarette companies. One of his famous ads, Luckies are less irritating. Engineering Consent is an incredible book where he spells out how to actually manufacture consent of opinion. Bernays, much of his classic style writing is used even today by groups such as ISIS in their propaganda manuals. Discuss exactly how Bernays crystallized public opinion and used much of the same techniques. One, for example, creating chaos and then providing an answer to the chaos that people join in on. So in other words, the same group that's creating the problem offers the solution. This is classic Bernays propaganda. So Ivy Lee's another big name in PR from the turn of the century, 19th to the 20th century. The folks at the time were called robber barons. They were big industrialists, social Darwinists. That means Darwinian capitalist, survival of the fittest. And people like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie in the steel industry were really ruthless business folks who exploited the non-unionized workers and even exploited the unions through. Rockefeller had a private military that actually was involved in a massacre with striking mine workers. So Rockefeller and Carnegie and others, the names we know Rockefeller Center, we know Carnegie Hall, the Rockefeller Foundation. He wanted to be remembered in a positive light, so he hired this PR man, Ivy Lee. He was called Poison Ivy, to create parks and plazas and charitable organizations so that future generations wouldn't remember him as a massacre of workers, of protesting unionized workers, but as someone who gave to society. And so today we have the work of Ivy Lee when we see Rockefeller Plaza and places like Carnegie Hall from Andrew Carnegie, who gave the money to preserve Carnegie Hall. So we'll look at a very interesting aspect of PR work there. It's called the video news release, or the VNR. And these major PR corporations will produce fab, ready to go, ready to insert news stories that news agencies can then use as filler time for free. So these things come ready to go with a little space for the news agency to put their logo in, and the people, these have been recorded in professional studios. They appear to be news, but in fact they're advertisements for a client, but they're presented as news, which makes them PR. Why do news agencies use these? Because they might have 7 minutes of dead air time that they don't have programming for. They quickly download a VNR off the internet, put it in, and now their space has been taken up. They don't have to pay reporters to find more news. Their space is filled. Let's take a look at one of these. You've seen these, and you may not have known that they were actually produced by private PR groups.
Identity theft is one of the biggest fears facing computer users today. Just ask Jessica Sweedler, who lost her identity from a new threat called phishing.
I was pretty surprised, actually, because the email looked so authentic. And I get things like that all the time.
Jessica is not alone. Phishing is one of the fastest growing cybercrimes, according to law enforcement officials. One computer company reported that nearly 60,000 phishing attempts were intercepted in June, up from less than 100 in January.
Phishing, because the act of phishing is an act to obtain identity or identity theft. It results in identity theft. It is a theft by false pretenses.
What it does is it sends out spam that's meant to make you give up personal financial information. If they can get you to give up that information, then it can be used to steal your identity.
Experts recommend be aware of any email request asking for personal financial information. Don't use the links of an email to get to any web page. Beware of unfamiliar web addresses, and only use sites you've gone to before. Software like PC-Cillin Internet Security is your first line of defense using a technology called heuristics.
By using 16 independent tests on each email and on each website that they apply to, we're able to judge whether that email or that website has good credibility or bad credibility.
One has heard of internet viruses spread by email and the damage they can do to your computer.
But now Jim Lawrence tells us a new email threat could attack your bank account.
Identity theft is one of the biggest fears facing computer users today. Just ask Jessica Sweedler, who lost her identity from a new threat called phishing.
I was pretty surprised, actually, because the email looked so authentic. And I get things like that all the time.
Jessica is not alone.
So here we saw an example of a VNR that was released by one of the major PR companies, and then secondly we saw how Fox News placed their logo over it and used it as filler time for a news broadcast. The viewer thinks it's news. It's presented as news. In fact, it's an advertisement. The telltale sign is the product at the end. The product that they're recommending that you purchase to protect you from identity theft or whatever else you're suffering from. So prwatch.org is a great resource. Check these folks out. They keep tabs on all of these VNRs. So you see here, you can click through and watch them and know what they look like. And once you've seen one, you can easily identify them for future. You can pick them up immediately. So this is a very important part of media psychology and media literacy, to be aware that some of what we were presented as news is in fact advertising in the form of public relations. And so psychology has a long history in advertising and public relations, as we saw Edward Bernays, the father of PR, the nephew of Sigmund Freud. Fascinating story there. We have here John B. Watson, the founder of behaviorism, the writer of the 1913 Behaviorist Manifesto. After a scandal in his academic career, Watson was released from all teaching duties, and he could never enter into academics again. He had an affair with a graduate student whom he ended up marrying. So he went into advertising, and he worked with J. Walter Thompson Advertisers in New York City, and he started at a salary 4 times his academic salary. And he basically applied the research methods of behaviorism, the methods of behaviorism to advertising, pairing ideas of attractiveness and appeal and sex appeal to different items such as brawn razors, showing billboards with a woman adoring a man with a smooth face and the picture of the brawn razor. So associational learning. He applying this to marketing. So this is one of the earliest relationships between advertising and psychology. John B. Watson. We also have Melvin Copeland, classic text in 1924 called Principles of Merchandising. And this is very much like psychoanalysis, the exploration of irrational drives and rational drives in creating a desire. So this is psychologist Melvin Copeland's 1924 text. We talked about Edward Bernays and his different campaigns, including getting women to smoke cigarettes, calling them torches of freedom, and linking them to the suffragette movement of feminism. And suddenly smoking a cigarette became a feminist notion, a cue of being someone that's independent. Very interesting individual. This possibly is one of the most important books you can ever get your hands on for psychoanalysis and media psychology, The Strategy of Desire by Ernest Dichter. And this is really psychoanalysis for advertising. This book is available. It's in print, and it is very much worth the read when you have time. So the Strategy of Desire, how to tap into irrational drives to sell products and ideas. And here's the book you're reading for class, Vance Packard's 1957 classic, The Hidden Persuaders. And this book really goes into detail about the influence of psychoanalysis on marketing. And this book, when it came out, really opened the eyes to many consumers realizing just what was going on in seemingly innocent advertisements. You'll notice that the documentary you're watching by Douglas Rushkoff is called The Persuaders, and this is a spin on the original 57 text, The Hidden Persuaders.